Hey guys, welcome back to the UNCOMMODiFiED podcast and to another unpeddling conversation that Chris and I are going to have today. Today's subject, Chris, is something that you and I have been talking a lot about. And before I get into it, I should say, good morning, Chris. How you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing great, Tim. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. Love doing these podcasts together because a lot of times what happens is that Chris and I are having conversation about business. Chris works with a team, his team across North America, and I have the privilege of working with Chris at times, and then I have other customers that I do work with. And so we've been talking about this idea about demand, the unprecedented historic demand that a lot of companies are experiencing right now. I know, Chris, you are right now in your company. I know my customers are. So today's conversation is around an idea that we've been talking about, which is this: don't let demand deceive you. Don't let demand deceive you. Now, there's a lot of great things about demand. We love demand, Chris, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Well, and sometimes you demand too. That's part of it, right? Isn't it?
Only sometimes.
Only sometimes. That's a dad joke, so that's the way it goes. So listen, don't let demand deceive you. That's going to be the conversation today. So when historic demand is coming down our throat as companies, as individuals, as sales professional, and we got people clamoring at our door to want to buy from us. And Chris, is that some sort of what's happening for you guys a little bit in your business today?
Yeah, and a big driver of it for us in our business is that there is some global shortages on certain types of products, which is creating demand, as well as there's huge logistics issues going on right now that's creating big delays in the logistics side of things. So we're seeing a lot of people who, may have not been interested in working with us over the years, or just people we haven't talked to, randomly come and wanting to drop pretty massive POs with us out of the blue. So it's very interesting times for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think on the consumer side, there's historic demand, at least in North America, on pent-up demand. People been at home a lot, looking at different things, looking at more disposable income. They haven't gone on big trips. I was listening to an economist the other day talk about the fact that many people in North America have some cash savings for the first time in a long time because they go away several times a year, and of course they may not have been doing that, particularly in Canada. And so there's some money that is being invested into things and creating this historic demand. But the challenge as an organization and as a sales professional is that if we're not careful, we can let this demand deceive us. And so what Chris and I want to do is have a little conversation today about how demand deceives us, because demand is great, obviously, but is it possible that there's a deceptive nature of demand? And I would say, we'll start the conversation, Chris. I think that demand becomes deceptive when individuals, sales professionals, and senior leaders or leaders within a company, or even sometimes just people within that company, say, I'm too busy too, because of that demand. And what kind of things when you think of that statement, and maybe you've heard them around you, Chris, people say, I'm too busy too. What kind of things do they fill in that next part of that sentence with?
Well, I think the one that concerns me most when I hear it in these times is prospect. I'm too busy to prospect. And maybe not even I'm too busy to prospect, but like we don't have enough, inventory to prospect. We have to protect our current customer base, so therefore we can't prospect, which there is an element of that, obviously, in these times of greater demand, balancing customers who are just coming to steal your stock over your partner's inventory and stuff like that. That is something to pay attention to. But when salespeople actually stop the art and the discipline of prospecting because they think that, well, I'm already hitting my numbers, it's going great. I don't need to be investing in my pipeline anymore, or as much as I probably should have been, I think that's where there's a predictable thing that's going to happen. And that whether it's 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the road, there will be a time when that salesperson who makes those decisions gets into a oh shit moment where they all of a sudden aren't hitting their number. And they haven't been investing in the thing that they know is going to continually drive their number for the last number of months or however long it is. So I think when I hear, I'm too busy to prospect, or there's so much going on, I just can't find time to prospect. It's like, well, don't find time. You have to make time to prospect in times of unprecedented demand. And that's how you stay above the curve, right? I think a lot of salespeople, they want to say to their, their boss or whatever, that when the economy's really good and that they're doing, making their numbers easily, that it's all the things they're doing, right? But when things are not going good, and then the economy's not great, they blame the economy and they don't take responsibility for their contribution to the bad, right? So and I think that's where we deceive ourselves for sure.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. There's another point of the deception is when we get this demand, all of a sudden it's because, man, I am the man. I've done such a great job, and this is what I do. Which is, again, we're not disparaging salespeople. They do a lot of work and do a lot of hard work. But sometimes you're right. What happens is, I think, it's like the airplane pilot who ends up, a half hour early because he's got tailwinds, and then he thinks he's the best pilot in the world. No, he just had tailwinds. That's just the reality. And so we have tailwinds in the market right now that are driving, and maybe that's a good point. Don't be deceived that the tailwinds are something you've created. You're benefiting from them clearly as a sales professional or as an organization right now, but don't deceive yourself. You're not responsible for the wins. You are responsible for how you respond to either headwinds or tailwinds in your marketplace. Now, the other thing I think about, Chris, when I think about this idea of I'm too busy too, what comes to mind when I think of some of the work I do with my customers, and that is I'm too busy to be proactive and strategic. And so what happens in these times, I think, is that people become very reactive, of course, because they need to respond effectively to the demand that's coming down the pipe at them, just like this huge tap of water or this rush of water down a pipe. But then what happens is that they say, I'm too busy to do that strategic planning meeting. I'm too busy for that proactive strategy meeting. I'm too busy to think about my next, my next year plan or 2 years plan or whatever it is that we're doing. And then we get into that bad feedback cycle. And the same thing I think that you said on the individual side when we talk about prospecting, it's that proactive and strategic nature. When we say that we're too busy to be proactive and strategic anymore, we have some big problems coming down our pipe in the future. The same type of thing, because we stop doing the very things that we need to be doing strategically, because there's still strategic projects. There's still things that have to be done. There's still ERP systems that have to be replaced. There's still macro projects that have to be driven through, and we can't drop the ball on everything as we respond to the demand around us. Now, when you think about that, Chris, how do you balance some of this tension? In your company, in your experience as a senior leader in your company, how do you manage the tension of not letting demand deceive you to the point where it strips out the proactive and strategic?
Well, I think one of the things that we implemented a while ago, which is a very, very simple concept that Mike Weinberg talks about in one of his books. And he talks about these one-on-one accountability meetings with your sales team. And basically, they're a very simple model, and they consist of potentially three points of the meeting. And what it focuses on is it looks at a salesperson's results, and then it looks at their pipeline, and it looks at their activity if needed. And I think that keeping the meetings and regular meetings focused around those things really keeps people's eyes on what you're going to be measuring, right? If as sales leaders, we're not asking questions of our team about prospecting during these times and how their pipeline is, then we're subtly telling them that it's not that important. If all we're doing is focusing on, hey, how's that deal coming that came out of the blue, and how's this going and how's that going, we are actually getting our salespeople into the wrong headspace. So what we do is at our place, my sales managers, they have meetings with their teams to basically say, hey, how are your results for the month? If your results were really good, then let's do a quick review of your pipeline to make sure there's stuff in there in your prospecting. And if there is, then that's the end of the meeting. It can be a 5-10 minute meeting. But if we get into your results and we look at your pipeline and your pipeline is anemic, then the question goes to, well, what are you doing with your time, right? If you're not investing in your pipeline, what are you investing in? Right. And so I think, again, it's just making sure as sales leaders that we are continually keeping our team's eyes on the right things, which is continual prospecting. And going back to some of the stuff that you and I have been chatting about recently around, disruptive emotions and how those come into play in sales, is that desperation is a disruptive emotion that hampers salespeople when they're not hitting their number. And what causes them is they start prospecting out of fear and desperation. Right. And so I would challenge salespeople to say, when demand is high, desperation is low. Therefore, this is an optimal time that you have to be prospecting because of the opportunity that you have to make a massive impact without the pressure of desperation. Right. So I think if salespeople reframed in their mind what this time is, right, some people can say, well, this time is difficult because it's too busy to do everything. It's like, no, prioritize stuff properly. Don't do the things that you don't need to do, and don't get involved in crap that you don't need to. And then understand that you're given a gift of prospecting in a time when you don't need to be desperate. That only comes up every once in a while. That is not the norm, right? So I think that's an important thing to remember as well.
No, it's a great point. And, I think as we move from the sales side to maybe the higher level executive strategic side, the one thing I would say is of interest to me is one of my customers that I work with has fallen into this trap, and they've recognized it, though, is that, it's a customer that I do a lot of different work for, and one of the things I do is I attend on a regular basis their executive team meetings. And so I'm part of that higher level executive team discussions so that I can help in some of the coaching consulting that I do for them as a company. And over the last number of months, maybe 6 months, they've fallen into a bad habit of getting off of their strategic planning. So they had a vision that they were been working on for the last number of years that is sort of this 2025 sense of who they were going to be and how they were going to get there and all the things that would need to get there. And what they found in the midst of this unprecedented demand, that strategic meeting time just fell off the rail. And their executive team meetings were getting more and more and more, frankly, in the weeds about operational challenges and inventory and stock, which, again, real life business problems. But they began to realize, and the president one day, I remember in this meeting said, guys, we've got a problem here. We're losing our way for the future. We're no longer talking about the important strategic things. And so he instituted the discipline now that once a month now, going forward at the executive team meetings, regardless of the demand that's coming down their throat, they're going to be taking time and they're going to be focusing on that 2025 plan. What are the macro things we're working on? What are we looking at for transition? All of this stuff, because all that stuff goes out the window really quickly when you're dealing with massive demand infrastructure challenges where it's just creaking and aching and everything is struggling to get through the demand that's coming at them. So again, whether you're on the sales side, whether you're on the executive side, regardless of where you are, the question is, are you making sure that you're not being deceived by that demand and it's causing you not to do the things that are proactive and strategic anymore? The other thing I think about too, Chris, is that when demand gets high, I think sometimes what happens is, again, we get too busy to follow our plan or follow our process because things sometimes come a little bit easier. That demand comes, customers call up and they're demanding something because they need to get it. And sometimes those deals come a little bit easier maybe than we expect because demand is an important thing. If we think about demand in general, demand has to be present. Demand and desire has to be present for deals to be made. When the customer's demanding something, then wholesale distribution wants to get it and sell it. When the wholesale market's demanding something, they're going to come to manufacturers like yourself and they're going to demand it. So that's the nature of deals are made when demand and desire is created. But sometimes when it comes a little bit easier or the customer's bringing a little bit more demand to the ask, we can actually get away from our good process. And that becomes a problem because we start putting those deals on sand. We haven't created a foundation. So let's talk a little bit about that. How are you balancing that tension right now when deals start coming and they seem to be coming maybe a little bit different with a different sort of push from the customer? How do you get it back into your plan or what does that look like?
Well, I think a big part of it is I would say being flexible and inflexible at the same time. So
Okay.
In terms of being flexible, like when people come to you, and we had an example of this a couple weeks ago where we had a customer come to us who really didn't do much work with us in the past. And they had a particular product category that they were really struggling with and wanted to see if they could get our help. And they wanted to give us like hundreds of thousands of dollars of purchase orders for this product. No price negotiation. The important thing was delivery. Like it was the easiest deal that could come, right? And again, I remember us having the conversation to say, okay, this is great that this is happening, and we need to be flexible to go fast, right? That's where the flexibility comes in. There's urgency. What we don't want to do is say, okay, we understand there's urgency. Now let me, stall this off so that I can make you go through my timeline. Right. So I think there is a sense of when there's demand in the market, I think you need to meet urgency. Right. But also, you also need to have those non-negotiable things and discussions that you want to go through and have to go through. And you want to make sure you have those. So again, before we took those purchase orders from this customer, we needed to make sure that we got at least an initial meeting with the decision makers and the influencers in the company, because it was an outside rep actually that brought this customer in. So we didn't really know them at all. And it was important for us to get to know them and have at least a conversation with them about who they are, what they need from us, all that kind of stuff. And again, through that process, they were so impressed with how we handled that and dealt with them that they actually recommended that 3 or 4 other companies who we don't really work with as well come and work with us on this product category because they felt like we were coming through for them.
Interesting.
Right? So that's that whole thing is there needs to be flexibility in terms of, I would say, the timeline and the way things are done, but we still need to accomplish the overall goal of what our process has in it, right? Even if it's a bit different than it normally is, we still have to do it. Right?
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. I mean, a lot of times, organizations have a specific sales process that they follow. I know that you guys do, and that process has been developed to create great partnerships and create foundation to put that stuff on. So you're not just building on sand; it doesn't just evaporate. If you're going to build a 30-story sales building, you need a 30-story foundation. And so what happens is, again, if we think about this, a 30-story deal comes in, and if we're not careful, we put it on sand, and it comes to us, and then it goes, it has nothing to set on long term. So I think it's a good point. Flexible to respond to that urgency, but at the same time going back to go forward. Maybe part of this, responding to this unprecedented demand, is demanding, in a nice way, but demanding that the customer goes back with you to go forward. Because if you don't, then what happens is that in the future, what's going to happen is when that demand isn't driving that desire of that customer, you will return to a day where you have no foundation of real partnership or relationship to put those deals on. And eventually what will happen is the desire and that demand might be lessened, but you haven't created any desire for real, true partnership. So that's the balancing force, I think. And I've always said to people, if a deal comes, you don't say no to it, but you got to go back to go forward, because if not, you're having nothing that you're setting it on, and you're going to be missing key elements. Like you said, you're going to 2 years from now, when the demand is a little less, you're going to be sitting around a table saying, how come we're not moving that customer's business? And somebody's going to say, I don't think we have a foundation. I don't think we know who they are. I don't think we understand their business. I don't think we even know who the decision makers are. So, and I think that's also something that happens, Chris, in days of tremendous demand. I think decision makers shift in companies. I think what happens is somebody who typically made those decisions, maybe it's a purchaser, or maybe it's this type of person in a company, all of a sudden somebody else is driving the demand and the decision for other reasons in the market. And then what's going to happen is that's suddenly going to shift back to a more normative way. It's going to resettle back and recalibrate back to the more normative way. And what's going to happen is the decision-making power might shift back in the company. And if we're not careful, we don't understand those dynamics. So again, don't let demand deceive you, that you really understand what's driving their desire to partner. Because if you fail to understand that, you might go forward with faulty logic in relationship to what is actually happening here. And I think that's the other thing too, Chris, is sometimes you take business during demand, and you have to realize you're probably going to see it for a while and you'll never see it again. And that's part of it. maybe you shouldn't say no to it, but you shouldn't make it more than it really is. Maybe they're just wanting to date. Maybe they don't want to get married. And be careful.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think too, that's where, that's where as salespeople, as you said, like establishing as those deals come along, when demand is high from the customer standpoint, it's really important to make sure that we're really establishing good ways to move forward, right? Not just good ways to have this deal. And I think, again, that's what in this situation, I think our team did a fantastic job, establishing, getting some background of who they are, why they needed us, what they could expect from us. Like, we're dealing with things where it's like, here's the lead time. I know you guys need it, but logistics are crazy right now. We can't promise you that this is going to be here in 60 days. I just can't. I will promise you that we're going to do everything we can. How often do you want to be updated? If there is delays, we'll reach out to you and let you know what's going on, what our plan is. Like, I think, again, establishing those good expectations as well when people are coming on board, trying to, coming out and wanting stuff out of the blue, clarifying what the expectations are, right, of the agreement that you're going to be entering into, I think is very important as well.
No, that's a really good point. The last thing I was thinking about, Chris, when I was thinking about this idea is, don't let demand deceive you in this idea that I'm too busy, and I'm going to complete the sentence this way, to do the little things that got us here. And again, this is maybe more a little bit, maybe for salespeople, but more for leaders. In the midst of unprecedented demand, sometimes we can forget the little things that we feel like we, quote, have time for in other things. Now, I don't like the term have time for, because there's only a certain amount of time. There's 1,440 minutes in every day. Everybody's got the same amount of time. You can't make time, find time. You can't do any of that. It's about focus and energy towards a moment in time. But the reality is sometimes we feel we're too busy now to do the little things. And so I want you to think about, even with your team, Chris, or with your organization, what are some of the little things that you do as a leader? And they're big in impact, but little. What are some of the little things that you do, in relationship to recognition, appreciation, whatever it is, on an ongoing basis, that if we're not careful, we're going to say we don't have time for that anymore because we're too busy responding to this demand?
Well, like for me personally, one of the things that I find very important is, for me, every morning I try to go around to anybody who's kind of related to my team in the office and say good morning to everybody, ask them how they're doing. And again, there's some mornings, like last week, there were some mornings or some days where it was like 2:00 in the afternoon and I hadn't gone around and said hi to anybody because I'd been in meetings since 8:00 that morning, right? And so, it's very easy for those types of things where you're like, okay, well, I just don't have time to do that. But establishing those connections and relationship is a very important thing to me. So I'd say that's an example for me. Like, I really need to make sure, it doesn't matter how busy I get. I believe that that's a valuable thing to do, to build relationship and culture and establish good team. And it doesn't matter how busy I am, right? Because that's very important. And I think that, for me, is a big reason why, I am where I am with our team in general, is because we do establish those little, that level of relationship, right? So I think that's an example from a leadership standpoint, not necessarily sales, but.
No, 100%. And again, that's a good reminder. If you're a leader, if you're deceive yourself that you're too busy to do the little things anymore because it's so busy and crazy and all your days is sorting out logistics problems. I get it. Okay, I get it. But if we fail to do the little things, we're going to have a problem, because again, like the foundation of the relationship with the customer, the little things are the foundation of the relationship with our internal teams, and we have to understand that. And I think there's another part of that, Chris, that we have to really be honest about. Don't let demand deceive you in this way. Not everybody loves demand, and demand is hard. It puts a lot of pressure on people. And so, when we're senior leaders, we look at demand and we look at that sales growth and maybe margin growth, and we love it all. But if we're not careful, we don't appreciate that there's some people in the organization that all demand means to them is overtime and weekend work.
Yeah.
All it means to them is extra pressure to get things done. All it means to them, or at least what they see in the moment, is something negative. And if we have to be honest about the impact of demand, and again, how do we take that negative energy or negative pressure out of the organization? Because demand isn't always seen as wonderful by everybody. Would you agree with that, Chris?
Yeah, 100%. And I think too, part of that goes back to, for me, is that organizations also need to understand how to scale properly. And I know if you remember, there was that Harvard Business Review book that I know you read on sales a few years ago, and they talked about scaling sales teams, right? And they did that study on companies that scale early, and maybe even what some would call prematurely. Long term, I think it was over a 5-year period they did that study, were significantly more successful. And I think that also applies to other parts of the organization. And the reason why I think a lot of organizations do not scale early, partly is risk management, obviously, and there is some validity to that. But I would also phrase, one of the things I wanted to talk about this morning was that also don't deceive yourself that unprecedented demand is actually unprecedented, right? I hear a lot of people talking to me about how, oh, it's great right now, but just wait, right? Just wait until the economy falls apart, right? Just wait until, you can't keep this up. Just wait until this happens. And my message is, no. We have realized through this process, at least in my company, that our understanding of the market was like minuscule in comparison to what it actually is. And so therefore, if we go forward deceiving ourselves that what we see today isn't real, then we will scale with those things in mind. If we say, no, this is actually just awakening us to the opportunities that we have been neglecting and missing because we haven't been fundamentally dedicated to prospecting, you take different approaches, right? And so I think that's very important to remember as well, is don't underestimate what demand can be. And if your salespeople are executing at a high level, they should be creating unrelenting demand that stretches your organization every single year. That's what a salesperson's job is to do. It's not to grow the business by 2%. Frankly, that is crap. If you're in a market that has growth potential and you are a lower market shareholder and you're a challenger brand, as Gary talked to us about a number of weeks ago, you should be able to create unprecedented demand for your organization year after year. And I firmly believe that. And I think when you have that mindset, it very much changes the actions you take in something like your operation side of the business, right?
Yeah, no, I think it makes a lot of sense. And again, these are just, hey, listen, we're just trying to get you to think about this. Don't let demand deceive you. And it deceives you in lots of different ways. And, again, you might agree with what we're saying. You might disagree. You might be screaming and yelling right now at iTunes. You know what? It's good. As long as you're thinking about demand and what it means and how you're possibly being deceived by it, or your team is, and whatever that looks like for you. Again, you don't have to agree with everything that we're saying today. And if you don't, I'd love to hear from you. If you do, love to hear from you. But we want to start a conversation because we know in the organizations that we work in, Chris obviously in his team across North America and his company, myself with the customer base that I have as a consultant and coach, we're seeing the struggle of this demand, and we're seeing some of the positive and negative behaviors that come on the back end of this. Now, I want to bolt on to what you just said, Chris, about scalability, and I want to introduce the word elasticity. And the way I see this part of this is again, it is risk management. It is wise growth, or maybe wise infrastructure building. Are we building a building or scaffolding, or what are we doing here? And it comes a little bit from my conversation I had with Pete Moore a couple of weeks ago, where Pete talked about on the UNCOMMODiFiED podcast and one of my Encore conversations. He was talking about his wheel of momentum, and under the area he was talking about capacity building. He gave a really interesting analogy, and I think it applies here. And he talked about like a school, and he said, they build a brand new school, and it quickly gets to capacity, and then you typically are not going to see a school have a big infrastructure project immediately for a brand new wing. What you're going to see is they're going to bring portables onto that campus, and those portables are building capacity to soothe that demand. Obviously, in this case, it's student influx, demand for those seats. But what happens is those portables will come, and eventually somebody's going to come to a point in time when you've got enough of them and the demand is consistent that, you know what, now we do need a new wing. But that those building with portables or moving against that demand and capacity need with portables allows a certain elasticity in case something changes. And I think it's a good point that Pete was making, and I think about it today. So how do we, when we're responding to this unprecedented demand, how do we in the beginning understand the tension of the risk management you said? How do we have a sort of a portable mentality maybe in some areas, not all, but in some areas? It might be labor, it might be infrastructure, it might be capacity. Again, instead of maybe buying a brand new machine, maybe we're outsourcing for a little bit more than we would, and then maybe we decide, hey, that as we see that demand, as you said, that we see that there's market share opportunity, and we see that, hey guys, this isn't just a one-off. We could have this demand for capacity long term. We can go after it. We can get it. You're going to find new markets. You're going to discover new opportunities, as you've been saying. Then all of a sudden you say, look, at outsourcing or a portable mentality isn't the right way long term. And all of a sudden now you make a very different decision, which is sort of that building the wing part of it. And I think that's part of the tension that senior leaders have to play right now. Where do they have elasticity? And where do they need a concrete investment in something long term? And I just think it's there's no right or wrong answer, but I think it's something that leaders have to consider. And I mean, what does that look like for you in your world? I mean, Chris, so right now you got this crazy demand. Are you seeing this play out for you on a consistent sort of business basis?
Yeah, and I think that really applies. I think operationally for us right now. And I think that concept of thinking through, what needs to be a portable expansion and what needs to maybe be a wing expansion, I think is a good question. And as you said, I don't think it's about a right or wrong answer. I think it's more just about options that we have as an organization to grow and how we do that properly. I think the one thing that, a lot of companies like us who, do importing and manufacturing, which I would say is, most businesses, there's not a ton of true, we manufacture everything from the core up businesses that I deal with and that I would know. There is more ability to build by growing through that portable strategy, right? If you're a consumer business with a new product idea, for, let's say a new type of keyboard, right? Your commitment has to be pretty solid to get into that market. You got to go out and manufacture millions of products, hoping that your market research is right, and take the risk, right? So I think too, there's a balance, because I think a lot of companies have the option of doing tons of portable growth without having to commit to something, which commitment also drives behavior, right? So I think that if my sales team knows that, hey guys, we're investing $2 million into our injection molding division and molding machines, it's our responsibility to make that thing go. And you guys need to do it. And here's the strategy, and here's how we're going to do it. I also think that strategy creates different results than we're just going to outsource more. Right. So I think there's a balance, and it's walking a tightrope for sure. Mm-hmm.
Well, and you just brought up a good point. Again, it's if you let demand deceive you to think you're too busy to communicate robustly, you're going to also be screwed. Because think about it, if you are acquiring manufacturing capacity through that portable mentality, in this case, let's say outsourcing, then the reality is that demand can come and go, and the implication long term isn't as severe on the organization, because you can shed that capacity as quickly as you can bring it on. But if you've chosen a more of that permanent solution, not portable, but permanent solution, then your sales team has to understand that you are committing them, and they are committing themselves to that demand long term. And I think, again, being honest about that. So if we're growing capacity through a portable type of strategy, then we don't have to maybe go with the same urgency to say, guys, once we get this, we've got to keep this. This is not, or you can say, guys, let's go out and get what we can, and when it goes away, it's okay. Don't worry about it. But if that's not the case underneath that, the infrastructure play is different. We need to have robust communication. Again, as leaders, don't deceive yourself. You're not too busy to communicate the why, the what, and the how. Again, what I think what gets shed out when times of historic demand and urgency, Chris, again, is that robust sharing of the why, because it takes longer. Getting people to, quote, buy in, it takes longer. And so all of a sudden we say, we don't have time for that anymore. Just tell people what to do and how to do it, and let's move on. But then again, we're not creating a great foundation for the communication that's happening in our organization at this time. Hey, listen, Chris, let's do this. Let's wrap this conversation up this way today. One thing that you want to remind our listeners of, or maybe it's a new thought, or just remind them of something we said. If there was just one punctuation mark you put on this conversation today as we lead to say, hey, if you are this kind of person, don't forget this. What is it that you would say to them today? And then I'll do the same.
I would say, and it's not something we really talked about, but just as we were kind of finishing up, I think going back to something that when we interviewed Lisa, just on market research, and just quantify what unprecedented demand actually looks like so that you can make decisions. I think, again, just because you're way busier today than you were 12 months ago, or maybe 18 months ago, because that's when everything shut down, understand, are you actually experiencing unprecedented demand, or are you growing market share? Because those decisions that you make out of that, I think, are very important on how you strategically move forward.
Good point. And if I could put an exclamation mark on a couple of points for me today, I want to speak to leaders. Don't let demand deceive you by letting you say, I'm too busy to be proactive, strategic, and to do the little things. Don't be deceived by urgency and demand for your time, and stop doing the little things that are required to sustain people for the journey. Demand is awesome, but it creates such pressure on people. And so when we stop doing the little things, we stop doing the very thing that will actually carry us through these times. The goal is to respond to the demand, do well, and for everybody to be benefited and enjoy the ride on the way, so that at the end of it, people are come through safely and well, and not burnt to a crisp on the other side of responding to this kind of demand that's coming at us right now in the market. And yes, it could be sustainable, and so long term we might be adopting a brand new way of understanding our businesses. Listen, guys, thanks for listening in today, and do us a favor. If you agree with what we're saying and you've got some points to make, reach out on social media. If you think absolutely that what we said today is nonsense, awesome, let us know. Email me at tim@theuncommodified.com, or check us out on social media. Thanks for listening in today, and have an excellent day.